I'm happy to introduce Vivienne Ming today. She is at the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at UC Berkeley and also at the Mind, Brain and Computation Center at Stanford. She did her PhD with Mike Lewicki at CMU and also spent 2 years of her life raising mollusks for consumption in sushi, the abalone seashell. Vivienne?
Thank you. Yeah, it was hard after spending that time with the snails not to become interested in human cognition. The parallels are just obvious. I like kelp. So I'm going to talk today about research, a large part of which I did for my dissertation, and then maybe some teasers on some other bits of stuff. And this includes some work which is currently unpublished, but hopefully should come out sometime soon in Psych Science. So it's always difficult for me to gauge my audience. So please, jump in and get a sense of what's not enough computation, what's too much neuroscience, or the flip, if that's your preference. So I'm sort of an auditory researcher with my particular bent. Although everyone at UC Berkeley they're all virtually all vision science people. And in fact, my lab as a grad student was sort of vision science. And in the world of sort of computational perception, you have a bit of an ego issue being an auditory researcher because eyes are sexy. And ears, sort of not so much. And then, you mix ears and science, and odd things happen. But the truth is, there is something really fundamentally interesting going on in sound, and practically interesting as well. So I'm going to talk about a particular issue having to do with how to deal with real-world signals. In particular, this issue of, give a sense of the color, of windowing your signals and dealing with sort of known problems in block coding, and propose a model for dealing with that particular problem. And then if we can deal with the coding issue, maybe we can even go and actually learn not just, say, for a linear basis representation, not just the coefficients, but actually learn the dictionary that you're going to use to describe natural signals. And then finally, I'm going to touch on some actual behavioral experimental work, which was an outgrowth of this computational research. So let's just start with coding sounds. And, working with the time-varying waveform that is here on the left is difficult. There's a lot of wonderful information there. In fact, all the information you're ever going to get about the sound is there, but some sort of transformation is almost always in order. And in particular, my personal preference is a transformation that increases sparsity for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that a sparser distribution implies that you're going to have a more compact code, but a sparse representation also is telling you something a little more interesting, hopefully, if you've selected your dictionary well, something a little more interesting about the signal itself. But there's a problem there in searching for the right representation to work with, in that almost all of them work on this sort of block coding formulation. If I'm actually going to do something like an FFT, I need to choose a reasonable window to do it over, or else switch over entirely into a frequency domain. But there's a lot of temporal information and sound that we actually want to capture. So for example, here we have two triplets of overlapping windows. They're all about 33 milliseconds overlapping by 11. Kind of standard stuff, Hamming windows. And this is an actual bit of speech, someone saying Vietnamese, with a little sort of strange under-articulated T right in the middle there. So what you can see if you look and compare the FFT or the LPC spectrum from, say, A1 and B1, the first red curve and the first blue dotted curve, down below is that they basically overlap. They're really capturing something very simple, and you get something similar with A3 and B3. And yet, right in the middle there, A2 and B2, if you look at their frequency representation, you see that you get something very different in the higher range. And yet, these window alignments here are completely arbitrary. One is just as valid as another. But there's something, obviously, this little t in the middle here, a non-stationary in this stationarity in the signal, which is just not amenable to a fixed block. And although you could use coding schemes that use variable block length, variable window size, there's no way to capture the real world periodicity of a natural signal with an arbitrary window alignment. Could always do just a simple convolution. Same signal here convolved with three little sort of Gabor filters, and clearly they're kind of capturing something. The high frequency filter is obviously picking up the little T-like element. The lower frequency maybe is picking up the basic fundamental, and yet really it's our visual system that's doing all the hard work here. And now we have 3 times as much data to work with. So how to deal with a problem like this? Well, not surprisingly, given my education, which is largely in neuroscience and psychology, I think about how the brain deals with this. Here's a little bit of unpublished data from Tony Zader's lab, in which they found that in awake behaving rats, this is using a technique called patch clamping, so they're actually looking at the voltage fluctuations inside a cell. They found that for a given class of sounds, test sounds, very few cells were significantly active at any given time. The vast majority of them, the firing rates are very close to 0, and a few of them are capturing most of the content of the sound. So I want to capture a little bit of that flavor, that sparsity that's represented in the mammalian cortex. And so I'm going to draw on the spike, or better yet, the actual neurobiological spike. Now, for people that are very serious about their neuroscience, I'm going to abstract away to the degree that it's going to offend someone. My spikes, as I'm going to use the term, have magnitude. They're not action potentials, but there's something about that temporal sparsity, that discrete temporal support of an event, which I really want to capture in a representation. A second topology. I'm a little bit under the weather, so I hope my voice holds up. So how are we going to go about this? Well, here's a really simple model. Linear superposition. I'll go through it graphically a bit more for the sake of anyone who's not familiar with this sort of approach. But we have a simple dictionary of kernel functions which can take any form. For now, let's assume we just fill it up with something we know works well for sound, say gamma tone filters. And they have some weighting, a set of coefficient values. We'll assume Gaussian additive noise. And then we sum both over all of the kernel functions in our dictionary, but also across a bunch of time instances. So we allow a function to occur anywhere in time that's appropriate for describing the signal of interest, that signal being some sound x of t. And we can give this a probabilistic formulation, all fairly straightforward stuff, in which we have something like a likelihood here, which we just make a Gaussian data likelihood, and again, stretching a little terminology, a prior here, which we want to be very sparse. Turns out that the specific distribution for that prior is not terribly important in this case, but as long as it's significantly sparser than Gaussian. So as I said, our goal now is to actually do signal encoding using this basic model. So we can certainly take the probabilistic model and try to find the set of coefficient values which sort of maximizes the data likelihood, some simple Bayesian arithmetic, and we end up with a log gradient for doing this estimate if we actually wanted to do gradient descent on the millions and millions and millions of sample values per kernel function that are going to come out of any kind of reasonably sampled sound. 44.1 kilohertz per second for standard CD audio is getting a little out of hand for standard gradient descent. So in a moment I'll describe another way of going about it, but just for the sake of illustration, here again is this generative model in which our kernel functions I'm going to assume for now are just a fixed set, in this case gamma tones, gamma modulated sine waves, but it could be anything. In this case, gamma tones have some implicit frequency axis. Time value specifying when precisely that gamma tone is sort of laid down to describe content or structure in the signal. And a coefficient value just to give a magnitude to its instance. Then, we just kind of sum along the dictionary axis here, the frequency axis, and you end up with a signal which, while a rather ugly sound, is at least illustrating just generatively what's going on in the model here. So we can reuse the same kernel function at different instances, give them different coefficient values. Very unconstrained in that respect. So how to do the actual inference? Well, working with full-length sounds, it's a little difficult, and I want to stay away from the windowing, as I said originally. So my first year as a grad student, I was so proud to have invented this fantastic new algorithm, proof and all. At the end of the year, Mike gave me this paper and said, you may want to read this. And then a couple years after that, I found out that mathematicians call it von Neumann's method, which meant I was scooped just a little bit. But I'm sure that happens to everybody. So matching pursuit is a relatively straightforward. It's sort of the simple tool for what can be a hard problem. We have, again, our sound, x of t, and we want to decompose it essentially just in a way via regression by projecting the sound onto our kernel dictionary, using that to weight the kernel of interest, and then leaving a residual left over. We choose our kernel by the one that maximizes some cost function, in this case an inner product, and then finally iterate. Take the residual from before and stick that in as the signal of interest. It's simple, it's greedy, it's imperfect, but it has some nice properties. So here's just a little illustration of how it acts with a real signal. So there's a little sound up top, and again, our fixed dictionary of gamma tone functions to the left. The convolution of the signal with the gamma tones, which sort of act as a filter bank in this case, produces this sort of energy surface here, which is being illustrated. Each maxima in that surface is located. The matching kernel function identified, its structure appropriately weighted is subtracted out of the signal, and then down at the bottom, the resulting representation, this sparse spike code, as we sort of want to call it, is what's left over, plus some residual. So there's a lot of flexibility in what one might do with matching pursuit. The most straightforward is how you actually decide to stop the process. Simple as thresholding, threshold at some coefficient level, threshold at an SNR for reconstruction, which is what we do. And then that gives you, say, a variety of possible levels of encoding. So I'll play this out here. I may need a little boost. And hopefully it'll be audible in the room. But the upper left corner here is 5 dB reconstruction, then 10 dB, 20, and 40. It just gives you a sense of how the algorithm progresses.
Fill that canteen with fresh spring water. Fill that canteen with fresh spring water. Fill that canteen with fresh spring water.
So this first one is really difficult to hear, partially just because there are so few elements that it doesn't actually have a lot of energy in the initial estimate of the sound. But the truth is it's actually capturing most of the structure, say, in the vowel of, this is the actual representation here is just can from canteen. So it's capturing actually most of the structure of the vowel in that can sound. In fact, if you kind of mask it with a little filtered white noise, it really pulls back the whole bit of speech. And by 20 dB here, it's getting to be a fairly accurate representation. And in most of these cases, you're using very, very few elements to actually do the sound representation. And I'll get into sort of quantifying that later. So here's just a quick comparison. The word up top is pizzerias. And then the 3 different representations here, the waveform, the spike code, and then the spectrogram at the bottom. This is really just to illustrate that a lot of the same information is represented in both, and that you can kind of see that the form and structure is present in both, and the sort of basics of the harmonics and the onsets are there. But if you look more closely, and here we're going back to this word Vietnamese, you can see that there's a meaningful difference. So the spectrogram representation on the bottom is showing this big starburst for where the T is being articulated. Not especially well localized in time, although there are tricks for fixing that, or in frequency. But when you look at this sort of spike representation, as highlighted in the inset box in the middle portion, you can see that really 2 single events, each of which has a magnitude and a time, so 2 pairs of values is pretty much capturing all of that little T-like structure. In fact, just using the little elements in the inset box, you can actually reconstruct just that part of the speech. Done by hand, not sort of claiming that this is an automatic process, but it's really the compactness of the representation which is most interesting. But as I said, matching pursuit is certainly not perfect. For example, since this is a generative model, we can always just generate test signals by generating sounds using the actual dictionary itself. So for example, making a whole bunch of clicks with gamma tones that are, in the first third of this, separated in time by short segments, or in the second set, 2 different trajectories which cross in frequency space. And on the top is what we inferred actually doing gradient descent, and the bottom is with matching pursuit. And if you actually close in, say, on one of these cases where the clicks are very close in time, you can see that the gradient descent approach actually recovers the original, maybe you can't see to be honest. In gray is, the gray thick line is essentially the test sound, the test signal, which is the addition of 2 identical kernel functions shifted slightly in time. And the gradient descent finds those 2 functions. Matching pursuit, however, because it's greedy and iterative, first picks the best kernel function to capture the entire structure all at once, and then has to go back and do this residual cleanup, which is a messy process and imperfect. Fortunately for single speakers or speakers with very different pitches and so forth, this sort of problem isn't as serious, and so doing things like speech analysis turns out to be fairly effective with matching pursuit. So we have a basic coding algorithm. Do we have to use a fixed dictionary to actually describe the sounds of interest? And what could learning a dictionary actually tell us about natural sound statistics? So again, here's the generative model and the sort of probabilistic formulation. And of course, very simply, we're just going to take the derivative of the probabilistic model with respect to the parameters of our dictionary, which is just a set of FIR filters. So essentially, it's all of the sample points in these vectors making up our kernel functions. Yes?
So you're taking also a gradient of what you call log prior, which is just an L1 penalty, as is?
As is, yeah.
Okay. That's mathematically ill-defined.
It is, and actually, in the case of the inference step, that's a bigger concern, although practically it actually works. Here, we're doing something which one might assume is even worse. We're just assuming that the coefficient values are independent of the kernel functions themselves. And so when we do the derivative here, that the prior completely disappears. We're assuming that it's going to be an EM type algorithm, so we're assuming that at each step we've already found sort of the optimal sparse set for doing the encoding. There's much more detailed works on the sort of bit of research on the sort of work that inspired this approach, but it's a fair point. There's a lot of kind of approximations to what we truly want for these models, but importantly is that the results sort of demonstrate that it's robust enough to overcome those limitations. So what we end up with at the end is this rather simple and elegant bit of work in which the gradient estimate for the kernel functions is simply the residual error after all of the encoding's done, weighted by the residual error at the precise time point at which one of these spike events took place, weighted by the magnitude of the spike that was at that time point. So in other words, we can actually code up an entire signal, several minutes worth, and then just go back and sort of collect the error data associated with each spike and average that. And amazing enough, that's just the gradient to the estimate for the update. So what does this mean practically? Well, being that I'm a sort of computational cognitive neuroscientist, I actually wanted to look at some question of interest to the brain. So we took this opportunity to collect a bunch of natural sounds, animal vocalizations, for example, environmental transients like breaking twigs and rocks dropping on one another, and ambient sounds, the wind through the leaves, rain, running water. And we want to see what does if we learn the dictionary for this, what does it look like? What kind of structure is going to emerge out of it? All we did essentially is sum equal levels of power from each group of sounds, and we call this sort of generically a natural sound database. There's a lot of discussion that's possible about what a cat would actually hear as it traipses the forest, but for simplicity's sake, this is exactly what we did. We initialized our dictionary of kernel functions with simple Gaussian noise, all the same length. Each of these little gray bars is a scale bar that I believe is about a millisecond long. So all of these are the same, Gaussian, I believe about 80 samples to start with, for 16 kilohertz sampling rate. But I give a little leeway because we threw in some simple heuristics by which we could actually learn kernel functions at whatever temporal support is necessary. Since we have this model in which we're allowed to just drop our functions wherever we want them, then there's no real constraint on their size. So we allow them to sort of learn their own support. And then we started playing sounds. And as we did, these things kind of regularized. You can see, for example, up in the far top left-hand corner, a fairly high frequency, at least by indicated by its scale bar, with a particular shape. And as you look further down, they're sort of organized by length, low and lower frequency kernel functions. But they all seem to preserve a certain basic shape, a sort of sharp onset, gradual decay, kind of classic sort of decaying resonator look, but in this case, inferred from the sounds we trained on. So it has structure, but does it actually mean anything? Well, here's some data that's wonderfully made freely available at the Ear Lab at Boston, coming from Laura Carney. This is CAT RevCore filters. So these are simple linear estimates of the filtering process of the CAT cochlea. So each one of these blue curves indicates a kind of frequency and bandwidth selectivity for a given cell as it processes incoming sounds. So what we thought to do was basically just take one of our learned kernel functions and find a filter in the database with which it was highest correlated. So all we did was a little bit of phase alignment. We actually didn't do anything else. There's no rescaling or anything. And then I'll show you here just overlaying them. So while the fits certainly aren't perfect, at least for me, they're also strikingly similar. Again, a very strong asynchrony, sort of temporal asynchrony, asymmetry, in which we have a fairly sharp onset, gradual decay, sort of classic gamma tone-like structure. Now, we could be fiddling a bit here with our choices, but let's say we just train on other types of sounds. For example, up top, we only train on those environmental transients and ambient sounds, so no vocalizations whatsoever. Or down below, we only train on the vocalizations. Well, you learn something very, very different. Up top, you can see the functions are extremely short in time, very compact, and down below of these very elongated, in some cases 100 or more milliseconds, very frequency specific. In no case is there really a clear asymmetry to the structure either. We can kind of do a simple little population comparison to make certain I'm not cheating, since I picked the best fits for this sort of thing. For example, we can do the same process of finding best fits in the CAT data for just, let's start off with the Gaussian noise kernel functions that we initiated the system with. So in that case, the best fit between our dictionary and the CAT data for each element, the median was about 0.4. For vocalizations, training just on the vocalizations, the best fits were around 0.6. For environmental sounds, better still, 7.5, 7.6. But when we train just on the natural sounds, or I shouldn't say just, but on that superset collection of natural sounds, I find a significantly better match to the CAT data. And in fact, if we just look at those RevCore filters, which the natural sound kernel functions fit well, we can in turn fit them with gamma tones, which is what part of what gamma tones were originally designed to do, was to describe auditory filters. And those fits are really comparable. They're not statistically different from one another. So as a population, then, we can look at these. The little blue dots here are individual CAT RevCore filters plotted in terms of their center frequency, the frequency that sort of gets the best response out of the cell, plotted against their bandwidth. So classic shape here, essentially, the low frequency filters tend to have tighter bandwidths. And as frequency increases, the bandwidth increases in approximately logarithmic fashion with a kind of pseudo-linear portion at the beginning there. If we just look at those environmentally trained functions, you can see that they do follow this basic logarithmic trend, but they don't lie in the same space as the CAT data. If we look at the actual animal vocalizations, well, they seem very different. In fact, they kind of seem invariant. Center frequency is sort of invariant to bandwidth, more of a harmonic kind of representation. But the actual natural sounds data produces a sort of distribution in the dictionary that falls right in the space of the sort of cat data.
What's in the natural sound data besides the union of those two other sets?
There really isn't anything.
It's just those two things put together?
Well, sort of the three, but you're right. I mean, the combination of the environmental sounds and the vocalizations, yeah.
There's nothing else added in there? It's just the environmental and the vocalizations?
No. So, you know, it's the sort of more detailed sort of look at it that you can think about. For example, we've played around, for example, with different ratios of combinations of the two. So there isn't a lot of, the ambient environmental sounds don't have a lot of, the sort of correlation time is very, very short. Whereas the correlation time in the vocalizations tends to be very, very long. And if you kind of vary those two, you basically, in the set of the kernel functions, you sort of vary the length of, or in other words, the bandwidth of the functions themselves. And so as you change that distribution, you certainly move off of this overlay. This is the case where the sort of picking from that set gave the best description or the best match with the biological data. So, you know, we've looked at a lot of different sounds. So these different classes of sounds that went into the training set, the kind of mix of sounds, sort of unpublished and not terribly thorough, but we've looked at music, we've looked at bird song. There really was only one other class of sounds that seemed to capture this same structure, and that's speech. So we took the Timid speech database, and we did the exact same thing that we did before. We just play a sentence, we do the coding, we take those coefficients, we do learning on the kernel functions, we use that, we do the coding. Again, a basic sort of EM process. And although I would argue that these are sort of different, a slightly different looking set of functions, they also show a really striking correspondence to the animal data. So again, the learned functions are in red, and the cat data is in blue here. And we can again look at this kind of comparison population here, in which speech and natural sounds don't significantly differ in terms of their correlation with the cat data. But you can do something simple like just flip speech around and code it up backwards, and you get a significant decrease in their correspondence. It's not surprising, as you might guess, you learn functions which are flipped backward in time. And as you can see, that temporal asymmetry is a significant part of the description of the cat data. And then if we look at it, again, as a population, somewhat hard to pick apart, but the English data also lies on top of cats. And we've also now run Arabic and Taiwanese, a tonal language, and we found very similar results. So we kind of summarize then by at least speculating that the mammalian auditory system has evolved to represent the sort of statistics of natural sounds, and perhaps our vocal apparatus, our generator system, has subsequently evolved to take advantage of the channel capacity of the auditory system, which it inherited. There's evidence of a little bit of change in both since we've been speaking, but I don't know. I've never noticed my cats to be particularly good with English, despite these results. And it also holds with this basic form of the cochlea data holds with chihuahuas and Mongolian gerbils and a variety of other mammal species. So what about actual coding efficiency? Well, so what do we gain by learning a dictionary versus just using off-the-shelf? Well, let's at least show that we've got some improved sparsity here, including a signal up top. I can't remember what the signal is when I made this filter years ago, so let's assume It's my favorite timid sentence. She left my dirty suit in greasy wash water all winter long. And then we'll show essentially an encoding of that sentence using a dictionary which has just started a couple iterations into the learning process, midway through and at finish. And I believe it's pretty clear that the sparsity of the representation increases rather significantly as you go along, with each non-zero event capturing much more structure. So these are all encoded to the same 15 dB levels, but each non-zero event is encoding much more information about the signal as training goes on. The dictionary is becoming more coherent with the signal structure. So another way to look at this then is sort of classic rate distortion, which I'm going to flip into a sort of rate fidelity here. So rate along the bottom is just the cost of transmitting a certain amount of information, and then fidelity in terms of SNR is going to be the benefit you get for transmitting that. So of course, ideally, the green line is better than the blue, more fidelity for less cost. So what we did was we just took a uniform quantizer and sent different kinds of codes through and used varying the quantizer as a proxy for changing the rate here. So we did it with a Fourier FFT, with a Debussy wavelet, with the spike code using a fixed set of gamma tones, and then finally with the spike code using the actual adapted learned kernel set. So what we found most clearly is that at very low bit rates, the spike codes are substantially more efficient than the alternative, really running from very, very difficult to understand below 5 dB up into the range where it's more than interpretable, but really is quite clear. Furthermore, thinking about the spike codes, the actual adapted set is outperforming the fixed gamma tones, not an enormous amount, but significantly. And at 15 dB, that 3 dB difference there is a noticeable, perceptually noticeable improvement.
So what mother function have you used for the wavelet?
In this case, we just used one, just a Debussy wavelet.
Which is also as a compact support, like your.
So we could certainly
so what's
go
the
through.
big difference here?
We could certainly go through and remove, trivial low value coefficients from that as well. So I don't know that it's totally analogous, but that's the nature of the comparison. Ideally, of comparing the learned and the gamma tones is to show that the learning process actually arrived at something that was significantly more efficient than a sort of engineered approach. But it's entirely fair to say that there are better ways to do encoding using wavelets or even using FFT.
These wavelets aren't compact in the frequency domain, right? They're kind of jaggy edged.
Yeah, they're a little ugly in the frequency
they're
domain.
not nearly as good as gamma tones for describing
Well,
voice sounds and stuff.
I don't get it. At least what I remember from physics, and every function that has a compact support in the time domain is going to have lots of uncertainty in the frequency domain, whether it's the wavelet function or local spike codes. So both should have basically very, very broad spectrum.
No, we'll have to take that up later.
Okay. Heisenberg was wrong, I guess.
No, you're just over-interpreting what he said.
There seems to be uncertainty on this issue, so we'll come back to it. Okay, so interesting. So now I'm going to just come to this last portion here and describe an idea which someone brought to us and we decided to test out. And this idea was fairly intriguing. So here on the left is a spectrogram of a bit of speech, something that most people here probably recognize. Maybe speech is a liberal interpretation of it. But we can remove a lot of the spectral representation here. Just save the temporal component. And in doing so, we produce something which is fairly difficult to understand, but still has these sort of speech-like qualities. And again, forgive me if you can't hear that well. Anybody know what that was?
He's a real nowhere man.
Oh, you got it.
He's a real nowhere man.
Often difficult for people to get, but that's the problem with giving a talk with smart people. Or maybe people that just listen to too much Beatles, of which I'm guilty. So why is this of interest? Well, there's some interesting perceptual experiments you can do with work like this. But in fact, this really noisy, ambiguous, and spectrally unresolved kind of sound is a lot like what you get out of a cochlear implant. So those individuals that have had cell death, particularly inner hair cells in their cochlea, you can actually essentially wire up a hearing aid directly to their auditory nerve and transmit this information by directly stimulating those cells. The process is in some ways complicated and in some ways not, but this is part of the part that's not, which is that you end up with this temporally precise but spectrally washed out kind of sound. So someone came to us and said, well, you know, we've only got like 6 or 8 frequency bands to work with in a cochlear implant. Could you actually learn the appropriate bands to use or the filter bank to front end such a system? So how does they do this? This isn't the most sophisticated way in which one could go about building a noise-excited vocoder, which essentially is what these systems are, but it's kind of standard for the experimental literature in which some speech waveform is passed through a bank of bandpass filters. In our case, we're looking at 6 filters for experimental reasons, which I'll describe in a moment. Then half-wave rectification, envelope extraction with a low-pass filter, and now we have these 6 envelopes, which we excite with Gaussian white noise. We take those same bandpass filters again and sort of band limit the noise. Now you have the original sound again, but with all of that sort of fine spectral detail removed. An example of a way to do this better would be to use, for example, Hilbert filters and just extract the envelope from using the analytic signal. It can be done either way. So would it be possible to learn a set of filters to sort of optimize, say, speech perception in this context for people using cochlear implants? Well, let's give it a try. We had 16 participants, CMU undergrads. Their task was essentially to take dictation on full sets of sentences from the Timmett trading database. There were 4 conditions. Sentences were either passed through a linear vocoder, so the vocoder had linear frequency spacing, but 6 channels. Cochleotopic vocoder, so there were, again, 6 channels, but sort of in a cochleotopic arrangement, frequency-wise, sort of a pseudo-logarithmic arrangement. A vocoder based on our learned filter bank, so we run the whole system on the Timmett training set, test set, on the Timmett training set, but assuming you only had 6 filters to use. Sort of like, what if you evolved that way? And then finally, they actually took dictation also on just normal speech. They never heard the same sentence in the different conditions. And then we just measured how many words they were actually able to take dictation on correctly. So what we found initially is that CMU undergrads are not good at taking dictation. And perhaps not surprisingly, no one's good at hearing things that have been passed through a linearly spaced vocoder. It just is not the way our hearing system's set up. Most intriguingly, though, when you compare the cochleotopic versus the sort of efficient learned filter bank, there's almost a 50% increase in the number of words that individuals were reporting correctly. And that's non-trivial, as you might imagine. So what would be great is knowing why. So we basically just reran the experiment, again with another 16 participants. We had half the people also shadow, which means they repeated the words rather than just typing them, just for comparison's sake. What we used this time were non-word phoneme combinations. So, a-ba, a-da, e-b, in which they had to essentially like phonetically type out what they heard. And we dropped the linear vocoder example. And then we just measured individually which phones, which little parts of speech they reported correctly. For people deeply invested in language issues, I'm just using phonemes and phones as stand-ins for something that I think is more deeply rooted in language. So averaging across all types of speech, we found the same basic trend. Performance in general was lower. There are not any actual words here. But there's again this significant improvement, about a 40% improvement here in the number of individually identified elements that were being reported. I should say, people are better at taking dictation than they are at shadowing. If you give people a chance to shadow, if they hear "gla," that's what they say. But if you force them to type something in a finite set of options, then they actually are more often correct than their shadowed reports. Vowels seems to have hit a sort of a ceiling here. There isn't a clear difference in the accuracy of reporting vowels in either the cochlear topic or the learned frequency bank. Fricatives are like sh, type sounds, very noisy. All literature says people are very bad at it, and this is just echoing that. There's, again, no statistical difference in the performance. It appears that stop consonants like b, d, ga drove most of the effect here. A very significant improvement in people's perception of stops with the learned filter bank versus the cochleotopic filter bank, which just didn't appear in the other parts of speech. It's interesting because here we can sort of look at the frequency layout of the different sets that we use. So up top is the linear filter bank, then the cochleotopic filter bank, and then down below are two different ways of working with the learned filters. So full disclosure, learned functions tend to be a little ugly and noisy, so they're smoothed in the case that we used here. The second to last, we smoothed by fitting them with gamma tones. And then the last we smoothed a little more naturally using a spline. So what's most notable here is there seems to be a very significant weighting towards low frequencies. And in that sense, maybe it's not surprising people do better at speech perception if they really have a lot of sort of perceptual representation at lower frequencies. Although I have to say I'm not convinced that that fully explains why people did well on stops, which in many cases, for example, ba versus pa is more like a voicing onset distinction, which is like on the order of 20 to 40 milliseconds timing. And so in that case, it's possible that features such as the very precise timing onset of the learned kernel functions enhances the perception or the localization of sound onsets. So that's the quick summary of that little experiment. Absolutely.
Go back to the filter bank. I mean, it seems like one interpretation is just that your wide filter bank is giving you better temporal resolution, right? You've got a really wide filter bank for your learned case, whereas the cochlear filter, although it's half the spectrum, it's only 4 kilohertz and above where it's wide. So what was the exact shape that you used for the cochlear? I mean, help me if but shouldn't it be more, shouldn't we have triangles?
Have triangles. Well, so I was
rounded filters or something instead of those flat bands. Yeah.
With the with the skirt on the left side, it goes out for a long time.
That might be what makes the difference.
well, okay. I think that's very reasonable. So in this case, I'm sort of inheriting the some previous work from Bob Shannon and others in which they have very specific sets of filters with specific roll-offs that they want.
So it looks like they just took cochlear bandwidths.
Bob Shannon.
Yeah.
So it's just cochlear bandwidths, but then they imposed straight lines on them as opposed to. more natural shapes, and you're learning
Yeah,
more natural
yeah,
shapes.
they're, well, yes, although that has its problems also. I mean, if you really, it's sort of luck that these things ended up being usable for a vocoder because you really want a set of perfect reconstruction filters, which is what they're getting by having their very constrained sets of filters.
Sorry.
Oh, not at all. Okay, so what did we find? Well, a way to represent signals which is time relative, gets away from window blocking and extremely efficient in its representation. Some interesting findings about the statistics of natural sounds and actually description down at the filter level for individual cells, as well as a description of the sort of population of cells that goes into the mammalian auditory system. A surprising or not finding that there's this correspondence between speech and the auditory system, and finally, at least the inspiration of a way to look or think about auditory prosthesis design, which focuses more on the computational task and less on the biological implementation. So just to finish up here, a couple of little teasers on things I'm currently working on. One in the upper left corner is a hierarchical model for spike coding, in which, for example, here there's a higher level unit that represents the probability distribution for interspike intervals. For, in this case, the difference between males and females voicing an ah type sound. The little animation to the right of that is learned subspaces, sparse subspaces. So this is a two-dimensional subspace for log frequency, log amplitude spectrograms, just as a way of starting to get a handle on the process. And very interesting things emerge out of that, such as harmonic stacks that shift in time and frequency, and formants that shift in length to allow for coding of the same basic formant structure, but with variable length. Pardon me. We've also looked at applying the very similar analysis to cochleograms and finding a very different result, although it's almost impossible to see up here. But essentially, the subspaces are almost entirely temporal in nature. They're picking up the periodicities in the cochleogram rather than these larger sort of harmonic and spectral components of the spectrogram. And then finally, I'm working on, for those people familiar with it, work by Gardner and Magnasco, in which they do a reassignment process to take spectrograms and turn them into highly spectrally sparse representations. The limitation of their approach is that they don't have a generative model, and they can't specify, or they don't have a system for learning the desired filter bank for the system that they're using. So I'm working on an efficient generative vocoding system which produces very similar results. And I think that's about all I'm going to get out of this throat. So thank you very much.